وعلى آله وصحابه أجمعين. So Alhamdulillah, we've now reached to the 9th halaqah, and in our last halaqah we of the father of Rasul والسلام, Abdullah. And today, before actually we would generally in the books of Sirah, the sequences now they talk about the obviously after the marriage, so the birth of Rasul والسلام. However, following the book that we kind of loosely follow, the book of Revelation that we recommended for everybody. So they, I think, mention a relatively relevant chapter, which it deals with the religions. Let's look at we looked at a little of the history of the Arabs, so let's look at the religious atmosphere and the religious sort of background and environment that we have at that period, because that's also going to come to play, because we're going to interact in Sirah with all these various religious groups. So to have some little sort of background on that would be helpful. Okay, and my thing is not clicking. Why is that? Okay, just a moment here, folks. My slides are not clicking. Why is that? Okay, so we're going to look at the region before Islam. So first we're going to look at it from the standpoint of the various religions that were prevalent in the region pre-Islam, and then we'll look at some of the dominant powers that were there. So today let's look at that. So the religions around Makkah. So obviously we know we have paganism, we have the idolatry of the Arabs, which was an adulteration which came incrementally, and as you remember that obviously the Arabs are the lineage of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, and so they started off in monotheism. They started off with Tawheed. However, as you remember, slowly these pagan things sort of creeped in, some of the influences of the surrounding areas. And if you remember, Amr ibn Luhay from Khuzā, who was the chief of Khuzā, who were in control of Makkah at that particular time, which was right around the first century. So he is the one that brought Hubal from Syria, and he was the one who started actual practice of idolatry as such. And then it just went downhill after that slowly, until by the time Nabi alayhi salam came, so they had multiple idols. Okay, so that's basically their belief set. So as we mentioned also more than once, the Arabs, since they had that grounding, or they were basically from monotheism, and they were from the progeny of Ismail, and there was a connection still with Ibrahim alayhi salam, and they considered themselves, the progeny and the followers of Abraham and Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam. However, they had, entered this paganism into their belief set. So therefore you'll find in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they'll say Allah. So they had this basic concept that was the original belief, but they had this interjection of these lesser deities that تقربنا إلى الله الزلفى. The concept was that we believe in the one great Allah, and there's other minor deities that kind of help us get connected to Him, right? So it wasn't as polytheistic as perhaps other areas and other religions that were or belief sets that were around. So that's basically the belief of the Arabs. So how did they look at monotheism? Like the Jews and the Christians and things like that. So they weren't really rigid on their their belief set. People, and therefore, as we mentioned earlier, even from the time, of Ibrahim alayhi salam and down, the Bani Israel, they also used to actually perform pilgrimage, and all the prophets used to come for pilgrimage. So the Kaaba was part, of the whole monotheistic, it was one of the sanctuaries, the farthest sanctuaries, of monotheism and of the deen of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so it continued. So the Jews continued going until they got kind of out of hand, as we mentioned, and then they stopped coming. But otherwise, Christians would come, whoever came. So whoever came to Makkah, welcome. It was like, we don't have a problem with anyone. Anyone who wants to worship Allah, that we don't have a problem with that. The other beliefs that don't coincide. So they didn't really have a rigid. They weren't like muta'assib. They weren't really very rigid on their beliefs. So anybody would come, and they didn't have a problem with them. And you did have, as we're going to mention later on, we did have a few of the Arabs who actually accepted Christianity. We'll talk about them a little later. Okay. Now, also Makkah, had that unique positioning, as we mentioned, because the Kaaba was there. And so it was also revered by everybody, not only the Arabs, but as we mentioned, from all the Semitic, religions, or the followers of the Semitic peoples, or the religions or the belief sets that were followed by the Semitic peoples. So everybody, had a great regard for the Kaaba, which was in Makkah, obviously, and people were coming for Hajj, people were coming for Umrah, and they were coming from all over. At the same time, it was as we mentioned, it became a commercial hub. So it was all encompassing, all in, accepting everybody who came through there. So it had that unique positioning, even though it was in the middle of nowhere, basically. But because the Kaaba was there, because it was, an economic hub, so it had a unique positioning also. Okay, the next thing, or the next belief set that we have that was prevalent at that time, at least in Persia and in the outlying areas where Persians had taken, a foothold and had their bases, was Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism, hard thing to pronounce, right? So the founder is Zarathustra, who they mentioned was in the 10th or 11th century before, we used to say before Christ, but now it's before the known, so people they had a hard time with that phraseology. In any case, around the 10th or 11th century BCE. Okay, now, so who was this fellow Zarathustra? So was he a prophet, or what was he? So we can't say anything about prophets that are not mentioned in the Quran. Minhum man qasasnahum alayk, wa minhum man lam naqsusum alayk. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned some of the prophets to us in the Quran, and those obviously we believe in. And other prophets, the Quran has definitely mentioned that we have sent them. We haven't made a mention of them. But we also know that prophets were sent to all the various main regions of the world, So everybody has, directly or indirectly, a prophet has been sent to them. So this fellow, was he actually originally a prophet? And did they originally, and they mentioned that it started out as basically a monotheistic religion. It started out with, the concept of one deity, and then it perhaps similar to what happened to the pagans of Arabia, and also what happened to Christianity, the concept of Trinity, which we'll talk about a little later. So perhaps that concept, they have this concept of duality. There's the force, there's the God of the good and the God of the bad, and they're always at juxtaposition and battle with each other. So that's basically their belief set. And they still are followers of that religion, Zoroastrianism. And in fact, in Pakistan, we have what we call the Parsi community. And so there's a community of, they're called Parsis in Pakistan. And you'll find them in Karachi and other places, particularly in Karachi. So there's still, followers of that ancient religion. Most of Persia, obviously, has accepted Islam, but there are still pockets of that. So that was obviously the religion of most of Persia. At the same time, they used to actually accommodate in Persia. It was also a refuge for Jews and Christians also. So you have also in Persia, Jews and Christians were there from quite a long time on, as they were also tolerant, apparently, for believers of other faiths. So that's their basic belief, this dualism, the God of the good and the God of the evil. Okay, then we have Judaism, and probably most of us know some basics about Judaism. So obviously, Ibrahim alayhi salam was not a Jew or a Christian. Ma kana Ibrahim Yahudiyan wala Nasraniyan walakin kana Hanifan Muslima. So Abraham was neither a Jew, he was neither a Christian. Obviously, because Judaism came after Judah, so whether that's the eldest son of Yaqub alayhi salam or the land of Judah or whatever. But in any case, that term Judaism, it came later on after Ibrahim. In fact, after Ismail and Ishaq, after Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam. So Judaism, the name of Judaism, it actually comes, as I mentioned, either from the eldest son of Yaqub or from the area which is known as the area of Judah. In any case, so is it Judaism, and then is Judaism actually a religion, or is it a race, or is it both? So it's kind of a mixture of the two. And therefore, you could be classified as a Jew and at the same time be atheist, for example, because you have that, so it's a lineage thing, and it's also, but it comes with a set of beliefs, because in their heritage and in their tradition, obviously, the set of beliefs which was handed down from, that those early times, and obviously, from the time of Sayyidina Musa, the Torah, and the law which became their canon law thereafter. So then what happened, and the history of the Jews, it's a very interesting history, and Muslims would do well to have some basic idea about that. If you like, you can also find something of the histories of Jews in the books of tafsir from the Islamic historians' viewpoint and perspective, and their research. You will find that, quite prolifically in the tafsir of Surah Bani Israel. And as you know, we have one surah which is by the name Surah Israel. It's also mentioned, it also has the name of Surah Al-Isra, because both issues are mentioned in detail in that surah. So in that beginning of that surah, you'll find a lot of commentary about the history of Bani Israel, which is very interesting. In any case, what we want to talk about here is that Bani Israel, due to circumstances, they ended up traveling around and having to move around from time to time, and from also because of the conquest of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire, among others. So the conquest would take place, they would be taken into slavery, they would get released, they would go back to Jerusalem, and so ultimately they started moving around, and since there was oppression, against them, so they would seek refuge. So probably some of them came to Arabia seeking refuge very early on. They say perhaps around the 1st century, BE, or BC, I should say. So, or CE, I should say. So, some of them had actually settled in Arabia, and specifically in Yathrib, which we mentioned probably earlier, which later became known as Medina. Some of them also settled in Yemen, and they settled in various places, in Khaybar, in the Wadi al-Qura, in various places. And it's also mentioned that when some of them happened to reach to Yathrib, they recognized that this is the place which seems to be the place which is mentioned in the Torah, or is mentioned in our scriptures, that describes the place where the last prophet is going to migrate. Okay? So identifying that this seems to be that place, so they remained over there. And they were waiting actually for the prophet to come. The problem was, when the prophet came, he wasn't a Jew. So that caused a major issue, because they couldn't accept a prophet who wasn't a Jew, except for some of the lucky ones who didn't let that influence their decision. Otherwise, the rank and file, even the rabbis and the chieftains, were not prepared to accept the prophet, even knowing that he was the actual prophet, because he wasn't from them. He was from the Arabs. Okay, so we had Jews also there, and the Jews were in Arabia, as we mentioned. Okay, Christianity. Now, obviously, Christianity, the origin, there wasn't originally, during the time of Isa alayhi salam, he didn't call his followers Christians, obviously. Even the name Christ or Christians was obviously not, their language. His language was Aramaic and Hebrew, probably. So the origin of that was that he was sent, as the Bible alludes to, that he was sent to reform the Jewish community. I've not been sent except to the lost sheep of Bani Israel, the children of Israel. Something of that is mentioned, something of that nature is mentioned in the Bible. So he's considered by us, and he's considered by the early Christians, or the early followers, I should probably more accurately say. The early followers of Jesus considered themselves Jews who had now been reformed, and some of the laws and regulations, which were extremely strict, some of them were sort of relaxed. Otherwise, they were basically following Mosaic law. So the early Christians were not actually Christians per se. They were actually, it was considered a sect of Judaism, and they were Jews who had been reformed, just like we have in Islam the concept of reformers, mujaddideen. So, however, mujaddideen in Islam are not prophets, but Isa alayhi salam was actually a prophet, but he came to, as the last, you could say, the last prophet of Bani Israel, and also the last chance for Bani Israel to, sort of get their act together and follow him, and his teachings and his guidance. However, as we know, most of them didn't. But those who did, so they continued to consider themselves Jews, but they were reformed in that sense. And then, however, later on there was the transformation, and then ultimately it's Paul, the Apostle Paul, who's mentioned, who was not actually a follower of, or wasn't the companion of Jesus. He came quite some time later. In any case, the whole concept of Trinity was totally a foreign concept to the early followers of Jesus. There was no concept whatsoever, And if the mention of the Son of God and all that is probably, if there is such a mention, it was sort of like just sort of referring to the close relationship. Obviously, the creator of the universe is unlimited. He has no beginning, no end. So he doesn't have progeny, neither he was begotten, nor does he beget. Lam yalid wa lam yulid wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. And so it should be quite obvious to anyone that a human being is not going to be the progeny of an all-powerful and unlimited creator of the universe. He doesn't have progeny. So it would have been an affinity type of a figure of speech. In any case, but somehow, it's a long story, and those who are interested, you can research that. But ultimately, that concept of Trinity, came into being, and that was the formula which ultimately the Romans, when it became the Roman Empire, actually accepted Christianity and became their official religion. So also there were the various versions of, so what was Jesus teaching and what was Christianity, and so the version of Trinity, which was also perhaps more palatable since they had been very steeped in paganism themselves, the Romans and the Greeks, and all the people in the surrounding areas. So if we can't have all those gods that we had, at least three, it's better than just limiting down to one, or however the case might have been. So around the 3rd century, so Trinity started, that took the shape of the official religion of the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire. And so as we mentioned, that was originally a Jewish sect, then it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and now some of the Arab tribes, you're going to see Ghassan and Tay, which are close to the Roman Empire. They were influenced by them, and they actually became Christians. So you had Arab tribes who had actually, they were totally, Christian themselves. And then you had these, what were known as the Ebionites. who also were present, and they were the ones who clinged, to the original teachings, or as far as that they could understand, wallahu alam. And so they considered themselves as Jews, but they considered themselves the follower of Jesus, and that he was a Jewish prophet. And they also continued to follow the Mosaic law. And so they also, obviously, they didn't buy into the concept of Trinity and the divinity of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. Okay, now, both, especially the Jews, as we mentioned, because the Jews, why they were there in Yathrib anyway, so we mentioned that they were there waiting for the Prophet to come. And they used to tell the Arabs that, maybe you have the upper hand today, but when our Prophet comes, we're going to fight you and we're going to, get the upper hand on you. And he's going to come, and they used to say, and in fact, they used to swear in the name of the Prophet to come. So people were, actually hearing about this. So the Jews were all in anticipation of a prophet to come. At the same time, not all of the Christians, but you had certain elements of Christian, scholarship that understood that yes, there is a prophet to come. And Hiraqal was well aware of that, and then the famous hadith in Bukhari, which Abu Sufyan is interviewed by Hiraqal, and he asks, and he mentions, that there's a prophet coming, and I didn't imagine he's going to be from you guys, but it looks like he is. And so he actually confirmed the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In any case, we had Christian elements who were waiting for a prophet, and we had the Jews who are definitely, they were all waiting for the prophet to come. Okay? And so also, since in Medina, or in Yathrib as it was called at that time, we had the Aus and Khazraj who had been for centuries living with the Jews there. And they had been listening to that, and they were always being threatened that our prophet is going to come and we're going to take care of you guys, right? So they also heard that, they also understood this concept that there's this idea that a prophet is to come. And that's very significant because in Hajj, while Nabi alayhi salatu is still in Makkah, when the tribes come from all over Arabia, and Nabi alayhi salatu with Abu Bakr meets them and starts giving them da'wat. So when Aus and Khazraj came from Yathrib, and they said, hey, you know what? This sounds like the prophet that the Jews, are always threatening us with. So why don't we beat them to the punch, So that was one of the factors that, encouraged them to accept Islam, because they had actually been hearing about that. So they were kind of prepared for that whole concept. Okay? Okay, now lastly, we have a very interesting, group of individuals, few, but very interesting. And they were called the Hanifiya. Okay? Not the Hanafiya. That's the followers of Abi Hanifa. This is the Hanifiya. And as Ibrahim is mentioned in the Quran, وَلَكِنْ كَانَ حَنِيفًا مُسْلِمًا. Hanif means leaning away and, moving away, being distant from all wrong beliefs and remaining upright on the path of monotheism, of Tawheed, of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these individuals were a group of people who, from the Arabs, who were not actually, even though some of them actually did become Christians, but originally they were people who could realize through the very, through logic, and probably from reflecting on, what Ibrahim's legacy was, and just using their own common sense, that there's one creator, and we don't believe in these idols, and we don't believe in this slaughtering of animals, to these idols that have, they don't help. It is God who has created, Allah has created for us, everything in the universe, created these animals, and we're slaughtering them to other than Him. That doesn't make any sense, right? Similarly, they also used to object to those practices, the pagan practices, and those skewed practices that the Arabs were practicing, for example, burying their daughters and things like that. So we had a number of individuals who, it goes back, sometime before the advent of Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, maybe the 5th or 6th century CE. So it was basically a kind of reaction to the idolatry of Arabia. So they were saying, no, we don't go for that. We believe, by their own nature, their own intrinsic nature, what we call fitra, they, could understand that, that Allah is one, God is one, and He has no idols. He has no partners. That's not possible. So they were scattered around Arabia, and you had a handful of them in Makkah. Most ostensibly, we had Uthman ibn Huwaydith, and this individual, he was among those Hunafa and among a number of individuals who actually, they took a pact, among one another, that we're not going to worship what these pagans are worshiping. We're going to worship the one God. However, we can figure out how to do that, and we're not going to sacrifice things to other than Allah, and etc. So he actually wanted to bring Makkah back to that pure monotheism. So he went to Byzantine, and he was trying to get the Byzantine rulers, in fact, they say that he met Caesar, and that he wanted to actually, he said, look, help me, and I'll help you guys, because I want to, establish my, my belief set there. So it was going nicely, according to what they say, the historians, that they said, okay, we'll back you, we'll help you. However, Quraysh didn't buy into the concept, so it didn't work. So that kind of fizzled out. You had Warqa ibn Nawfal, who was the cousin of Khadija, and of course his story probably is known to many of you. And he was the one, when Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam got his first revelation, he was the one that Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha took Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to Warqa, who had actually, he was among those Hunafa, and he could read and write, and he read, previous scriptures, and he had actually become a Christian. Probably among those Christians who were closer to the original followers of Jesus, Wallahu alam. In any case, he was the one that, consorted and comforted Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and told him, yes, a prophet is going to come, and I wish I would be, able and strong and able to help you when your people push you out of Makkah, And so Warqa was also from among those Hunafa. Okay, now we have also Umayyah ibn Abi Salt, who was a famous poet in Arabia. And he was also among the people who had that concept. And in fact, his poetry, Nabi Alayhi Salam used to really appreciate his poetry, because it would talk about, the nature and, the creation and how all this, and it would connect it with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Nabi Alayhi Salam also mentioned even that, his poetry, accepted Islam even though he didn't. Because actually he was alive when Nabi Alayhi Salam came, and he was thinking about Islam, but unfortunately he didn't accept Islam, and he died actually during the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You also had Ubaydullah ibn Jahsh, who was the brother of Zainab, al-Mu'minin radiallahu ta'ala, and he was also the former husband of Habiba radiallahu ta'ala, bint Abi Sufyan. And so, since he was a Hanif, and he went ahead and migrated with the Muslims, because they were closer to what he was believing than, the pagans. So he actually traveled. Now, whether he had actually accepted Islam or not, it's not totally clear. But in any case, he made hijrah with the body of Muslims who made the first hijrah. And when he got to Ethiopia, unfortunately for him, he actually, accepted Christianity, and then there was the split between him and Habiba, whose actual name was Ramla bint Abi Sufyan radiallahu anha. And consequently, Nabi alayhi salatu, and he died there, by the way. So they were separated, since he didn't accept us, he became a Christian. And he actually died over there, and he was buried over there. And Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, in a gesture of, tasalli for her also, among whatever, objectives, that was probably one of the key objectives. And so she being, having a very high position also in Quraysh, being the daughter of Abi Sufyan. So in any case, Rasulullah consequently married her. Okay, and then last but not least, we didn't mention Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufail. Allahu Akbar. So he was really an amazing individual, and he was probably one of the most salient of all those Hanifs. And he was also alive during the time of Rasulullah, but probably he died before Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam became a prophet. And in fact, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had met him and mentions about him. And he would sit there, next to the Kaaba, and say, "You Quraysh, there's nobody here in this Makkah, that worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except me." not praising himself, but just saying, nobody is and he also was very adamant against, all these sacrifices to the idols and the bearing of the female daughters, etc. The female offspring, and so he's also mentioned in the hadith in Bukhari, and his story and things about him are mentioned in hadith itself. So these were the various religions. So we have the mushrikeen, the pagans, we have the Zoroastrians, we have Jews, we have Christians, and we have the Hunafa, these Hanifs, who are just trying to hang on to the Abrahamic tradition. So just to get a little idea, so these are some maps, so you can see here where those major idols of the Arabs were. Okay, so Manat we have in this place called Qudayd, which is sort of juxtapositioned between Mecca and Medina. And then we have Al-Uzza in Nakhla, and we have Lat in Taif. And they used to actually travel to these places and slaughter animals, and they had their own rites and things that they used to do. This is also a map which shows you the various religions, where we had Christianity, where we had Zoroastrianism, where we had Judaism, etc., and idols. Okay? So there in Yemen we have Jews, we have Christians, we have Zoroastrians. Okay, we also have, as you see, in Eastern Arabia, we have Zoroastrians, and we have scattered around Arabia, we have various centers of idolatry. We also have the Jewish communities specifically, or most prolifically, in Yathrib and Khaybar. And then, obviously to the north, we have Judaism, we have Christian strongholds. And if you'll notice also, the Bani Ghassan and Lakham Tay, particularly Bani Tay, from the Bani Lakham, and from the Bani Ghassan, we have those who were, close to the Byzantine Empire, and they had actually become Christians. So those were Christian Arabs living in the northern part of Arabia. And then obviously in Abyssinia to the west, on the other side of the Red Sea, we have, obviously, it's a Christian Christian country. And then we have also a Christian enclave in the eastern part of Egypt. So that's kind of the religious atmosphere that we had at that time. So we keep that in mind, because we're going to be hearing, the interplay of these various religions and their personalities in the Sirah. And then next we're going to be looking at the powers that were, right, at that particular time. So inshallah, in the coming week. By the way, this dars will now shift from 12 o'clock until after Asr. So everything in Ramadan is going to be after Asr. All durus, whether it's Sirah, Suluk, Hadith, etc., it's all going to take place, inshallah, after Salat al-Asr. And also, we'll just remind everyone who have heard or who haven't heard, that between Asr and Maghrib, we're going to have continuous programs here at the masjid. There will be durus, there will be tilawat of Quran, there will be adhkar, dhikr, dua, and so we're trying to encourage everyone to come and participate in what we call the ta'mir of the masjid, the building of the masjid. Now, alhamdulillah, the masjid, as you can see, we're in the masjid now, and alhamdulillah, so that building of these infrastructure and physical structure, that's significant, but that's not actually really the main building of the masjid. The main building of masjid is with actions, with a'mal. So, inshallah, we're requesting everyone to join us. Also, the section for the ladies is now fully, operational. So we're requesting, our brothers and sisters. And in Taraweeh, we're going to have arrangements also for the ladies inside, and the ladies who have smaller children, to place outside so they don't disturb, the rest of the musallin. At the same time, we're going to be having iftar and meals every day, free of charge, to people who need to do that and who come, and there's quite a large gathering that usually come every day. So inshallah, there's going to be a lot of programs. Our tafsir after Fajr is going to be continuing, inshallah. And so looking forward to being with all of you, inshallah, either physically or virtually. Wa jazakumullah khair. Was there any questions?
Yeah, we have 4 questions.
4 questions, okay.
So the first question, bismillah. Did connections of the Prophet ﷺ's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, in Medina help him post Hijrah?
Help him post Hijrah?
Yes.
Of course. And we're going to find that, when we come to the Hijrah, which is sometime down the road, that the Bani Najjar, they're the ones who are going to, open up. And we mentioned that early on. So not the connection of his mother and Abdul Muttalib. So all of those connections, are going to come to play. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Second question: the direct forefathers of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were all on monotheism?
No, we can't say that. However, Abdul Muttalib apparently had a close connection with some of those Hunafa. As we mentioned, we talked about Abdul Muttalib. You can see that he has this very deep belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to see in the Amal Fil and the confrontation between him and Abraha is really stellar. However, we can't say that he wasn't also involved in those pagan practices, and that's why when Abu Talib dies and they're after him, hey, are you dying on the the religion of Muhammad or on the religion of Abdul Muttalib? So he says no, on the religion of Abdul Muttalib. So Nabi Sallallahu was really, really saddened by this, because obviously this means that he didn't die as a Muslim. And so that infers that no, he unfortunately doesn't seem that he was on that. And of course, what's in people's hearts, we don't know about that. But apparently, he was on the belief set of his people. But at the same time, as we mentioned, the Arabs in general, and he in particular, had this strong, belief in Allah. Unfortunately, this other stuff was also mixed into it. Wallahu a'lam. Yeah.
All right, third question. This is a big one. What is wrong with Judaism as faith in present time? It's obvious in Christianity, and let's say in Hinduism and paganism.
Yeah. So whatever is which is congruent with our belief set, as we mentioned, all the prophets were what? They were Muslims. They were submitters. Because as we mentioned, Judaism, Christianity, these names were something that came, like on the way, right? So what's the significance? So we don't have a problem with the basic belief sets. We have a problem with, once a new prophet comes, you can't say, well, I'm not going to accept that, So the problem with the Jewish community is that, yes, they are the closest to our belief set, particularly the Orthodox, because they even follow their Sharia and all that, which is very close to Islam, which means that they should be the closest people to accepting Islam as well. But very amazingly, that's not the case. It's not amazing. There's reason for that. But in any case, so the issue is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends, consequent prophets, you have to believe in them. You can't say, well, I'm going to stick to what I have. The creator of the universe is sending a new prophet. Look, there's a reason for that. So Jesus alayhi salam, Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, they came to take religion just to the next level. It was always Islam, right? So each prophet came ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take Islam to the next level. So we don't have a problem with the belief sets. We have a problem with that they didn't accept prophets who were sent by Allah. And you can't do that. You can't believe in some and disbelieve in others. You have to. That's why our belief is we believe in Allah, the angels, and the prophets. All of them. If we disbelieve in any prophet, we're out. We're out. So because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends a prophet, you have to believe in that. So I hope that answers that question. So that's why this concept, well, we all believe similar, so it's all fine. Actually, it's not a question of belief. It's a question that the religion is being upgraded and updated. For example, I believe, in President Obama, Well, that's fine. If you're a fan of President Obama, that's fine. But he's no longer the president, so you can't cling to that. I'm going to follow whatever you. He's not the president anymore. So you're going to have to go with the new president. Of course, presidents are elected. Now, here, we don't have an election of the people. We have Allah himself sends a prophet, so you don't have the alternative to, believe or not believe. So if we are believers, then we have to believe in all the prophets, all of the books, and in the sequential order, And since Muhammad ﷺ is the last, so we have to go with that. And it's all the better for us and for all of humanity, if they could understand. Okay.
And the last one, did Waraka ibn Nawfal become Muslim?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and hopefully, yes. But we can't say for certain, because Nabi Sallallahu at that particular point in time, he wasn't actually instructed to invite people to the religion. He's just gotten the first revelation. And he doesn't even really know exactly how to process that, right? And that's why he was just really sort of shaken up, and Khadija radiallahu anha took him to Nawfal. Look, talk to my husband, see what is all this, But anyway, his comments, indicate that yes, he had total belief, and apparently he had belief in one God only. At the same time, it was seen, and then in Sirah it says, "Walam yalbath and mat and tufiya." So very shortly after that event, he actually died. Okay, so he didn't actually live to the point where Prophet ﷺ was actually inviting people to accept Islam. So, and then he was seen in dreams in a beautiful shape and in white, and so that's an indication that, inshallah, that he is successful and he succeeded. So that would mean that he would have died in a state of Islam, in the sense that whatever was presented to him, he believed in that. That's what we hope, and we can't be certain about that because there's absolutely no definitive statement mentioned. But it looks like, inshallah, that he made it, and we hope so. Wallahu a'lam. That's it. So jazakum, yeah.
2 questions, Shaykh.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so my first one is that you mentioned you could look into the tafsir of Surah Bani Israel and Isra,
Yeah.
more history.
Yeah.
Is there a specific tafsir that you would recommend?
The problem is that having opened up that issue, so Tafsir Qurtubi gives a lot of information. You can probably look in Tafsir al-Tanwir, those who are familiar with the Arabic versions. Tafsir Ibn Kathir also gives riwayats to talk about that. The problem is that there's a lot of discrepancy. There's the 2 times that the Bani Israel are going to come to dominance and cause a lot of mischief on the earth. When were those 2 times? When were they conquered? Who were the conquerors? So there's a lot of information out there, but you can get an idea what our historians have mentioned. Tabari also, obviously Tafsir al-Tabari, and Tabari also has his own history, which is an amazing book, and he wrote about that. And also Ibn Kathir in Bidayah wa Nihaya, he mentions about that. So with a bit of research, also taking from modern sources, we can kind of compare and come up with a basic structure. But you'll get the idea that they had a very, very amazing, very rich history. Sometimes gaining, the upper hand, and sometimes, being subjected into slavery, and then taken off to Babel, and it's an amazing history. By the way, out of the 12 tribes, a number of those tribes, their whole legacy was lost. We don't know much about them, and therefore probably 10 of those tribes, they call the lost tribes of the children of Israel, Bani Israel. Now, Shaykh Anwar Shah Kashmiri, in his commentary of Bukhari, mentions that, and he doesn't mention where he got this information, but he's a person of extreme, as we say, tahqiq. He was a very thorough researcher. So he mentions that most of those the children of Israel and those tribes who had gone up to various places had accepted Islam, actually. And therefore, the people of Afghanistan, particularly the Pathans, they claim that they are actually the progeny of Bani Israel. And I've written history books that give some pretty convincing arguments substantiating that. But again, since that's quite ancient history, we don't have the type of narrations and the ability to scrutinize the narrations like we have in Hadith. But that's very plausible. So in any case, that's where you can find that information. But you have to do a lot of sort of research to kind of tie up the loose ends. Yeah. And since it's ancient history, that's the nature of ancient history. Allah knows best.
And then Umayyah ibn Abi Asad.
Naam, Umayyah.
Do we still have any of his poems?
Yeah, in fact, even in books of hadith, some of his, in fact, Nabi Sallallahu used to, sometimes he was writing and he would have somebody, recite to him the poetry of Umayyah ibn Asad. Yeah, it's well documented. There's dawaween of that, and he was, one of the chief poets of the Jahili era. And it's really beautiful poetry, yeah. Right. So as I mentioned, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned, that he got aslama yani sha'ruhu walam yuslim qalbu. So even though he didn't accept Islam, but his poetry was Islamic. Yeah, basically, wallahu alam.
And then somebody said, can we make the class for 1 hour? Just a suggestion if everyone agrees.
Well, does everyone agree on that? If everyone agrees on that, then probably we can. Because as you can see, there's a lot of stuff that we can do. So if that's a consensus, then we can think about that. We'll make an announcement, inshallah. Yeah. Okay? Okay. جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله